When you get into really big organizations, it's very difficult sometimes to get them to think in a decentralized way, that they still have this sort of bias that all things can be planned centrally. It's not like when we meet people or we're working with people, we don't hand them the road to serfdom. I don't hand them the pure theory of capital, but I might talk about the use of knowledge in society, and I might talk about how knowledge is tacit and dispersed, and that there's no way that me sitting here in Manhattan can tell you what exactly employees are thinking out in LA. So the things where Hayek really intersects well with Boyd, it was the fatal conceit, is to showing those errors of central planning, those errors of thinking that knowledge can all be centralized and we can make decisions for everybody.
Every once in a while, we have to invite a couple of badasses onto the show. Brian Ponch Rivera is a retired Navy captain and instructor who now serves as CEO of AGLX Consulting. He helps Fortune 500 companies build high-performance teams and co-hosts the No Way Out podcast. We also have Mark Moose McGrath, strategist and partner at AGLX, who advises senior leaders on navigating complexity and building trust under pressure. Always a Marine, he writes the World of Reorientation Substack and co-hosts the podcast No Way Out with Ponch. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thanks for having us, Max.
Thank you.
First of all, I love reading the World of Reorientation. And when I saw someone who shared so many influences in me, but I tend to do it from the level of an intellectual, someone who appreciates the theoretical constructions and uses them to sort of evaluate how society and the economy emerges from certain kinds of rules, or, basically just a macro picture of how the political economy works. But what I noticed in what you guys do, both in the podcast as well as in the Substack that Mark writes, is you really bring application to some of these great thinkers. And I want to focus on 3 today. Does that sound good?
Absolutely. With one slight tweak.
Yeah.
I started and found it, and now Ponch does it with me. So we do both the podcast and the Substack together now. We're
excellent. All right.
Yeah.
Well, that's totally fair. So Ponch, you write for the Substack as well.
Yeah, usually about aliens and crazy shit. So yeah.
Okay. We can talk about aliens too if Hayek gets boring. But let's start with F.A. Hayek, Friedrich von Hayek. He's one of my favorite thinkers. He's known as one of the Austrian economists, along with Ludwig von Mises, who's also, just a genius. But focusing on Hayek, you guys have allowed this old Austrian economist and theorist to influence you in interesting ways. Our audience first generally about some of the theoretical constructions that you glean from Hayek, and then we can talk about how you apply them. But first, let's just talk about the theoretical level with Hayek.
Well, it's a build-on, add-on to the primary impetus thinker behind all of our work, who's John Boyd, which I know we'll get to. I came into Hayek and Boyd almost simultaneously in my time in college, and then as a professional officer, more into Boyd. But then towards the end of my active duty military career, I was given the book The Road to Serfdom, and it shattered my orientation in lots of different respects. It aligned with what I had been reading from Ayn Rand and what I had been reading from Milton Friedman, and it introduced me to Mises, because I actually started Road to Serfdom got me to Mises, which got me to the full canon of Austrian economics, which got me to quit my original graduate program and roll those credits over somewhere else so I could finish with a master's in economics, dedicated to really pursuing not only the theory behind Austrian economics, because that always made total sense to me coming from Jesuit schools and having broad exposure to philosophy, but the application of it and realizing that this is very real, and what the Austrians were describing is very real. When I got out of the military and I spent just over 15 years in the asset management world of Wall Street, I kept seeing all of the theory applied, and I kept seeing all of the different things like the Austrian theory of the business cycle and Mises's definitions of money and credit, capital, the capital theory unfold, and all that stuff. And Hayek was really good at that. And the other thing that Hayek was also very good at was the philosophical things about freedom and autonomy and sovereignty. And I'd always had this radical streak inside of me, despite having been raised by a career Army officer that went to West Point, and despite being a Marine officer, which we can actually talk about. The Marines really do promote wild radical thinking. Hayek was a very natural gravitation for me. Also, too, that both Hayek and Mises were field artillery officers, so they could, like myself. So I did have sort of a kinship with them. But Austrian economics was one of the things that really made more sense to me than anything else I've ever read, because I kind of hated economics in college with all the equations and indifference curves and all the stuff that we know is completely balderdash. And then with Hayek, eventually, as I kept getting deeper into Boyd, I went back to Boyd. I started unpacking and realizing that there was a parallel track of what Mises and Hayek were saying that really resonated with what John Boyd was saying. And then on one of our trips to the archives, I actually did realize that Boyd had studied Hayek himself. He'd read The Fatal Conceit and used that as a source for later versions of his seminal Briefing Patterns of Conflict. So when you look at the whirl, Boyd and Marshall McLuhan and Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, and then sort of Hayek Mises, that's all kind of a snowmobile that we're building as we try to develop the work of all the above. Starting with Boyd, but then adding on and developing the work of those other thinkers. And Hayek has been a really big part of that.
There's a lot of really good names there. I want to turn to those. Certainly Boyd, also Desjardins, and also Marshall McLuhan. But let's return to those in a moment. You said something that I want to focus on for a moment. You said most of this other mathematical macroeconomics is something along those lines, was balderdash. Why would you say that? Why would anyone say that?
It's not real. There's not in reality. I remember this thing at my first go in grad school was at the University of Pittsburgh, and I was getting a degree at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs in National Security and Intelligence Studies. And I remember in this macroeconomics class, it was actually a project. I had to explain the difference between George W. Bush and Oprah Winfrey's indifference curves. That ruined my whole entire that ruined my semester. Needless to say, I did not do well in that strand of economics. It's not real. Like the thing, I can't observe that in reality. There's no way I could ever know these things. When I had read Human Action, Road to Serfdom got me to Human Action, and somebody told me not to start with Human Action, but I actually did. It was just scales falling off my eyes, and I wished I could go back to college and study just that.
I want to share something here. So I went to CU Boulder, learned the Chicago School of Economics, a lot of Keynesian thinking. I think Hayek actually taught at Chicago School for a little while. But the most valuable thing I took out of my economics degree was the ability to read energy maneuverability charts in the future. That's it. And everything else was just nonsense. And a lot of that's driven because when you learn about complex adaptive systems, you start to realize that the linear approaches that they were teaching in economics just don't scale. They just don't work. Right. And is that what you're kind of talking about, Moose?
Yeah, it's not real. And the Chicago School is like a really good example to bring up, Ponch, because a lot of these great thinkers that could give very good verbal defenses of the free market, like Milton Friedman, but in practice, they just were orthodox Keynesians. Interesting to know, too, and Max would know this, that Hayek was actually only brought into Chicago to talk philosophy, and this philosophy of freedom and sovereignty. They wouldn't give him an economics professorship because he's a quote-unquote dangerous thinker, I think. And I think it also speaks to these thinkers that we're talking about, Max, like Boyd and Hayek and Mises and Teilhard and all that. I mean, these were radical generalists. They were interdisciplinary, and they were looking at things across the board and pursuing something much bigger than what they're remembered for. And it's sort of become a secondary mission. Like the primary mission is really developing and building off of Boyd and these other thinkers like Hayek. And then at the same time, a sort of a secondary mission has really become to defend their authenticity, because the interpretations of them are so widely inauthentic that it's also very important to Brian and I.
Milton Friedman really was much more empirical in his approach. And a lot of people from the Austrian tradition resist that level of empiricism, that data gathering. They feel like it reduces too much of reality to certain quantitative measures. I think there's a good interplay between the Friedmanite approach and the Hayekian approach, in that the Hayekian approach, it takes the complex systems aspect as a given and is humbler about the idea of being able to measure it in some way. But still, you have some ability to predict and forecast kind of these greater waves of activity. You're not going to be able to anticipate the movement of a price or something like that in 3 weeks, but you might do slightly better job. But more, you're going to be able to see bigger trends based on complexity dynamics. And
Yeah.
that's never going to be perfect. You can't, in conversation we've had before, there's the difference in the modeling that you probably learned in graduate school, modeling the 747 versus modeling the Amazon rainforest. It's just two totally different things you're meant to model, and one is complex, one is complicated. And Hayek really gives us that insight, even though Friedman does give us some empirics that I think are important and demonstrate the failure of Keynesianism, for example, in its own right.
Well, I think that anybody that I was going to say, I think that anybody is worth their weight of just even having a general view of economics, they should understand Milton Friedman. I mean, he was a Nobel laureate after all. The concept of libertarianism, of course, I'm saying that with a small L, not a capital L. There are very few that could give a better oral defense of free markets than Friedman, and those ideas are very important. And Mises and the other Austrians were not only aligned in that defense, but they were better in application because they did not get into the sort of orthodox Keynesianism that Friedman would be associated with.
What is it that you extract from someone like a Hayek, considering that the Austrian economists have really depend very heavily on prices
Yeah.
as their kind of shorthand for decision making in a dispersed system of economic system that's also complex. Whereas Boyd, you're not always going to have a price signal. Tell me first of all, how would one, I don't want you to give away your trade secrets, because some of the consulting practices I'm sure are trade secrets, but just in the broad view, what kind of lessons can you extract from Hayek and the Austrians to help people in a consulting
Uh,
capacity?
I'll start with that. I mean, I think that you mentioned prices. I mean, prices are signals, and
Mm.
signals need to be detected, and signals need to be understood, because it could, a weak signal can identify a trend early. I also think too, with Hayek, also his decentralized approach, that's critical to how we coach and advise leaders, specifically at, when you get into really big organizations, it's very difficult sometimes to get them to think in a decentralized way, that they still have this sort of bias that all things can be planned centrally. It's not like when we meet people or we're working with people, we don't hand them the road to serfdom. I don't hand them the pure theory of capital. But I might talk about the use of knowledge in society, and I might talk about how knowledge is tacit and dispersed, and that there's no way that me sitting here in Manhattan can tell you what exactly employees are thinking out in LA or something like that. Like I can't do that, So the things where Hayek really intersects well with Boyd, and remember with Boyd, it was the fatal conceit, is to showing those errors of central planning, those errors of thinking that knowledge can all be centralized and we can make decisions for everybody, that pricing is not important, and that they can be tweaked, and that we can make the market do anything we want through stimulus or money printing or whatever. I mean, there's a lot of really good parallels there. But I think generally with Hayek, and when it comes to Boyd, it really does center around that decentralized knowledge and the power of that.
That's really interesting too, because there was a sense in which, and I don't want to over ascribe this to Hayek, but in Law, Legislation, and Liberty, that 3-volume set really made this one of the most salient distinctions that came out of that was Cosmos versus Taxis, right?
Mm.
Where Cosmos is the extended spontaneous order. It's unpredictable. It's a complex system. It's going to essentially create a state of affairs of economic emergence. And emergent complexity is difficult, if not impossible, to predict in the way of what you called a linear system might, or where the
Yeah.
causal properties can all be sketched out or drawn like in a 747 that is predictable in its causal patterns. But if you have taxis part of it, Cosmos being the emergent order, he believed that, you really could in the firm do more central planning, and that was okay. That part of the extended order were centrally planned enterprises. Of course, he was probably aware of Ronald Coase at the time and the idea of transaction costs, and that some things did need to be planned. But what's interesting that you said is the bigger the company, the more things scale, and the more there are people, sometimes internationally, working different spots around the world. You really have to apply the Hayekian insight of Cosmos to Taxis or to the planned order of a
Yeah.
firm and allow some of those dynamics to play out inside the firm. Do you find that a lot? And do you guys teach that a lot? Or
Well, that's what we try to teach, that
yeah,
that order does emerge, and it often happens spontaneously. The more people interact with each other and the more they understand the interdependencies. I mean, that's also the nature of a complex system versus a complicated system. I think that most of the people in the sort of the Western B school mindset think the opposite. They think it's more linear, it's more formulaic. I can tell you when I was in the asset management world for 15 years, I could name the amount of Austrians I met like on one hand because nobody even wants to table a lot of these things. They really do believe that the economy is not an organic system of buyers coming to buy and sell, of humans coming in to interact and exchange with the other. They think of it more as something that could be stimulated like a machine, and we could add fuel to it. We can redo wiring and get the results that we want if we plan centrally. And we just know that to be patently false. And it's not it's just not real. That's not how humans work.
Well, some of
yeah,
those approaches are useful in ordered systems,
In
complicated.
certain areas. Yeah.
Yeah. But once you start using an ordered system approach in a complex system, you get to disorder or confusion, right? And that's kind of where we are as a society at the moment. Is there's a lot of, I wouldn't say liminal space, but a lot of disorder at the moment. People don't know why things are happening. And I think the reason for that is they just have grown up in a linear approach or a Tayloristic approach to management and leadership.
Mm. It's
Now, when
also
you say
too
you say Taylor, you're referring to Frederick Winslow Taylor. He's the guy
Yes.
who wanted to scientifically manage every aspect of the firm,
yeah.
Yeah.
assign managers to oversee all of the line people, and all the line people had very specific tasks, and
Yep.
only the manager would implement any change to that process. That's sort of like late 1800s, turn of the century to the 1900s.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
today you're saying that's not a good approach. What's the problem with that kind of approach?
You take agency away from the people, right? The people that are closest to the problem who can actually make a decision to fix it. So once you do that, you're disinviting them to be part of the solution, right?
Right. Right.
And this is what, there's a whole movement in organizations over the last 20 years to go quote unquote agile. And what that really is distributed approach to decision making. And that would be the intent. So that centralized intent, not the centralized plan, but intent. What are we trying to do? And let those that are closest to the customer or the problem try to solve those things locally.
Moose, please jump in there. I worry I shut you off and I
Oh
prematurely.
no, Punch hit it hard with talking about Taylor and things like that. And the one thing I would say that ends up becoming a lot of the work that Ponch and I do together centers around people trying to apply Boyd that way, linear, in a linear fashion, in a scientific fashion, in a formulaic fashion of treating it as something that could be overlaid, a template overlaid on top of complex scenarios or complex systems, and they fail. And a big mismatch of how Boyd is taught and what we're really think that we're always aspiring to be the leaders in this is that authentically Boyd would never have taught that. He would never have taught you to put a linear formula on top of complexity. He had a very deft understanding of complexity and knew how to handle it well, which is exactly why he structured things and taught things the way he did, as to avoid the propensity that people would have to go around and put templates and formulas on top of everything. So if recently did a podcast out in Los Angeles with a guy called John Becker that has a podcast for the debrief for law enforcement professionals, specifically tactical operators that run into crazy environments with hostage situations and bank robberies or whatever. And one of the things that really was the aha moment was that Boyd is not telling us to take this template of observe, orient, decide, and act, observe, orient, decide, and act. He's not telling us to do that. He's telling us to understand how we orient to reality, how our orientation shapes what it is that we see and has a direct effect on how we decide, act, and learn. Within that, that leads to not only learning, but also creativity and novelty and things like that. Becomes a part of our work only because the predominant force is teaching what we call bad Boyd.
Forgive this brief interruption, but I suspect you're here because you're disillusioned with legacy politics. If you're a creative, a builder, or an innovator, you might be ready to win funding. Through Human Respect Labs, you can get up to $30,000 to fund your next creative project. But not just any project. We're looking for 6 kinds of builders: video storytellers, community builders, writers, entrepreneurs, strategists, and innovators, any of which should be dedicated to human liberation. That means making government obsolete. Why? We know too much energy goes into politics, but not enough goes into real solutions. So if you're a freedom lover and you have a project idea that promotes peace, autonomy, and voluntary collaboration, we want to hear from you. Apply now at humanrespectlabs.org. That's humanrespectlabs.org. Criticize by creating.